So there has, oh, and the other thing I wanted to share with you, sorry, going back one more slide. So specifically on this, across 38 metros, the researchers found that 8.4% of homes in historically redlined neighborhoods faced a high risk of flood, compared to 6.9% of homes in historically green-lined neighborhoods, or where credit was more accessible. So there's many ideas in terms of what can be done from an adaptation standpoint. Particularly for these vulnerable communities and vulnerable households. And so you talked about kind of the issue with just not having enough cash. So, there's ideas around creating disaster savings accounts, rental housing deposit funds. One thing that kind of stood out to me was during a natural disaster, for people without much money, it can be hard to even having to relocate for maybe a couple months. It could be hard to come up with the rental deposit to be able to afford an apartment to stay in for a temporary period of time. Business continuity, so of course, like businesses are impacted, and businesses in these lower income communities, might already be at a disadvantage when it comes to banking relationships and access to credit, transportation assistance. So there's an example of community development financial institution in Dallas, where they helped get people back to work after Hurricane Harvey through low-cost vehicle loans for people with low income. And then there's also examples of upgrades to affordable housing to address resiliency. So whether it's installing solar panels or elevating HVAC, the HVAC and other upgrades, there's certainly examples around making affordable housing more resilient. So getting to what are some of the incentives for making these types of investments? And so three that I want to call out, and two of them might look a little repetitive, and there's some overlap, but so the Federal Community Reinvestment Act. So this was this 43-year-old piece of federal legislation that requires banks to make loans and investments in all parts of the community, including low and moderate income areas. And there's penalties if banks aren't kind of meeting their goals and their requirements under this legislation. But when it comes to climate change and climate resiliency, the statute has, or the regulations have provided credit for banks to kind of help act, so with disaster response. And right now, this legislation is undergoing a rewrite, a pretty major rewrite. And it's the first time in about 25 years that that's happened. So kind of looking at the rules and the regulations. And one of the questions that is being considered by the Federal Reserve is, should climate resiliency be given credit for events that happen pre-disaster, such as some of those ideas that I shared on that previous slide. So that could be, again, depending on how the rules are finalized, this could be an incentive for banks to invest more money on the front end to really help build the resiliency of people and communities, as opposed to responding after the fact. The New York State is one of just a few states that has its own kind of state version of the Community Reinvestment Act. And just a couple months ago, they released some guidance where they explicitly are now providing banks in New York that are regulated by this act credit for making these climate resilient investments. So, for example, renewable energy installations in affordable housing, which reduce utility payments, flood resilience activities for multifamily affordable housing, they have a long list, and actually I'm in the process of learning more about everything that's covered. But that is a real incentive for financial institutions in New York right now. And then the third incentive that I just want to bring up, and again, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but just a few examples, is the low-income housing tax credit program. So this is the largest federal program that subsidizes the construction and rehabilitation of affordable housing in the country. And each state actually sets their own priorities, and some state, which can include sustainability practices. And some states, and I do not know off the top of my head all the states that do, but some states really prioritize strongly sustainability when it comes to developers looking to receive these credits to support the either construction or rehabilitation of housing. And so again, it's administered at the local level, but depending on so states do really have an opportunity to build in climate resiliency within the within this program. And then I just want to share with you, kind of round this out, a couple of resources that I found to be helpful, and I think are, just, again, this group, I know these, but wanted to share the two with you. So, excuse me. The first is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. They have this Social Vulnerability Index, and this refers, so the index itself uses 15 census variables to help local officials identify communities that may need support before, during, or after disasters. And the term social vulnerability refers to the potential negative effects on communities caused by stresses to human health, disease outbreaks, or disasters. And here we are in the middle of a pandemic. I thought, well, I wonder how valid and reliable this index is. And so I kind of ran some back of the number calculations to see how strong of a relationship there exists between COVID deaths and counties in the US that kind of scored higher in terms of vulnerability on this index. And it turns out there's a very strong relationship between COVID deaths and highly or moderately or even high vulnerable communities. So that's a resource that, if you don't know about, I'd encourage you to check out. And then the EPA has put out this EJ Screen, which is this environmental justice mapping and screening tool, which is based on a national data set which combines environmental and demographic indicators in maps and reports. So I haven't used this as much. I'm not as familiar with it, but it certainly sounds interesting and something I'm going to be looking at checking out in the future. Okay, so I know that kind of ran through that fairly quickly, but I wanted to just give you a sense as to kind of, one, how the Fed is engaging with climate change and climate resiliency, and then two, really from the perspective of climate change and community development. What are some of the things that I'm seeing in terms of what the research and the literature shows is already happening, and how climate change is disproportionately impacting low-income communities and people with low income. And then finally, just wanted to share with you just some ideas to help with adaptation strategies, some of the incentives and the programs that create those incentives, and some resources. So I will be the first to say this is not. You all probably have just as much, if not a lot more, expertise on climate resiliency and sustainability than I do, but I will be happy to answer or attempt to answer any questions that you all might have.
Thanks, Mike. So there's not a ton of people. If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask Mike a question. You might want to do that before I start asking questions because I've got a lot. But I'll start out, Mike. It's more of a big picture sort of item. Does the Fed have any role in calculating GDP?
Um, I so I don't know for sure. I am not aware of the Fed having a direct role with calculating GDP. That comes from the national accounts, and I want to say that's the Department of Treasury,
Okay.
but it could be mistaken. It's
Okay.
not something I actually could say it's not something that really has ever come up in conversations that I've been a part of.
Yeah, so I wasn't sure if it was associated, but one of the things that I see with climate change is when we have these severe weather events and they say it's going to cost us $1 billion, that spending ends up looking like it's a good thing on GDP because rebuilding the houses and the infrastructure shows up as, economic activity when it shouldn't have been. So it'd be great if there was a way to count that as a cost to GDP as opposed to a benefit to it. So
Yeah,
that's
you're absolutely right.
so I did have a question. You mentioned flooding and the redlining that happened. With the flooding that's going on, flood zones are being redrawn all over the country. Have you heard of anything about how that might be affecting low income people? Because even if you were flooding, if you were not in a flood zone, your insurance was different, your property values were different, and all of a sudden a new line is drawn around you. It's going to completely affect everything about your housing value and your insurance. So I was wondering if there's been any impact of those new lines being drawn in the name of flooding versus race.
Yeah, so I'm aware that the lines are being redrawn. I haven't heard specifically about uh, how much that could be impacting low-income communities, but I will say that I know there's a real fear from like the private insurance industry, which is in some markets completely pulling back. So like in California, there's a fair amount of insurers that have completely pulled out of that market right now. And the fear is that insurance that then becomes prohibitively expensive, say
Mhm.
for low income homeowners, uh, as one example. And so I think that as we start to price climate risk into pretty much everything we do, there'll have to be a lot of decisions around how is that disproportionately impacting people with low income. And another example is the housing market. So it was a couple months ago, the Mark Calabria, the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, so this is the regulator that oversees Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, uh, he kind of point blank said that the climate crisis, housing might be one of the biggest industries in which the climate crisis is being most impacted, um, and because it's not taking into account climate risk, and eventually it will, but what does that mean for people who are just barely making their mortgage payments meet now?
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Okay.
yeah, I mentioned that because I think that really does all tie into the flood maps being redrawn, and just all the ways people are I think grappling with the reality of climate change and these extreme weather events.
Mhm. And I think one of the things that we'll need to be aware of, I mean, you can draw a flood, you can change the boundaries of a flood zone, but you can change them back with a levee or a flood wall or something, more of a constructed mitigation project. So that's one area where we have to make sure and monitor that neighborhoods have equal access to remove their neighborhoods from a flood zone if it was redrawn around that. And that's will probably have a lot to do with resident financing and probably municipal financing or levy district financing that's available. to protect neighborhoods that traditionally don't have that value that, more expensive or white neighborhoods might have, and might be able to leverage more to be able to get that kind of financing to do expensive infrastructure projects.
Right.
I
And
can throw something out there.
yeah, go ahead.
Mike, can you speak more to the Credit Reinvestment Act, the CRA, and the revisiting of it, and how, given that it's been 25 years since that act has been revisited, at least in regards to the enforcement of it, what change has taken place in the conversation since the last kind of revisiting of the purpose and opportunities associated with that bill and the financial institution support of LMI communities?
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. So I think say there's quite a bit that has changed. One of the, aside from the climate conversation, then one of the big questions has been banking services has moved online considerably from 25 years ago. We didn't have fintechs. We didn't have just online banks. If I were to deposit money into my bank, I would have to physically go to my bank. Now I can just pull out my phone and deposit that check. So that's been something that's been a big part of the conversation in terms of updating and modernizing the Community Reinvestment Act. And but then, kind of bringing this back to the climate resiliency piece is, I think that there's just been this recognition that communities have been hard hit, and it's one thing to kind of incentivize to clean up after a disaster, whether it's a hurricane in Texas and New Orleans, or wildfires out west, or flooding along the Mississippi, but that's not addressing the need to adapt to our changing climate. And so that's where the Fed is venturing into, for the Fed, really uncharted waters around what does it mean to incentivize adaptation strategies, and how can these how can we ensure that the benefits accrue to low and moderate income communities and populations, because that was the original intent of the law. And we all know, like, if we're going to be, as a country, to be serious about climate change mitigation and adaptation, it's going to cost a lot of money. And so I know that there has been a fear among some community groups that, well, Fed, if you go down this path, then that may suck up all of the money, and we might not have anything to address these other kind of needs of communities in which banks have supported, whether it's around housing or workforce training, workforce development, or investing in our small businesses. So yeah, Kyle, that's kind of like my log. There's a lot more that has changed in the 25 years. But outside of the climate, I think the biggest piece has really been the transition from physical brick and mortar banking to online banking.
I had a conversation with a gentleman in East St. Louis one time, and we were talking about the Community Reinvestment Act, and he said it's an interesting situation because it would allow me to invest in his neighborhood, but not allow him to invest in his neighborhood. So it was just an interesting perspective that I'd never heard of. I don't really have a question, but it's just one of those things that I heard about the Community Reinvestment Act, where it has good intentions, but the administration of it at the local level is not seeing the impacts that the legislation was intended to do.
Oh, that's interesting. Yep, I know another criticism has been just there's not really good data, publicly available data, on how much are banks investing in low and moderate income communities, and how does it vary by geography. And I know that that's a hope with this modernization, is to essentially get better data.
Mm-hmm.
so that we can clear up some of the ambiguity that exists.
Hmm.
So I see there's a question in the chat. Do you still find that economists have difficulty with establishing value for sustainable infrastructures such as forest and wetlands, other than strictly viewing, say, a tree as the amount of board lengths that it can produce, right? So how do you treat the value of our natural habitat? So I'm not an economist, so I guess I do not want to speak for economists in general. I can say that, okay, so what I will say is it seems like every day, and Kyle can jump into, but it seems like every day I'm hearing about more and more economists within the Federal Reserve System that are researching climate change. Now, does that mean that like they're all going to have this view of like how to value forest and wetlands, and does it mean just through the what kind of comes out of that, like how to value that? I don't know for sure, but it does seem to be a topic that's certainly kind of gaining traction and interest among our macroeconomic researchers.
Mike, you actually touched on exactly what I was going to point to, which is we're macroeconomic. Well, the researchers within the Federal Reserve System are macroeconomic economists, which means they're not only are they not looking at the tree, they're not looking at the forest. They're looking at the region of the continent that the forest is located. So a lot of the challenge that the Federal Reserve System in general is suffering with in regards to this, why don't you care about the environment perspective, is the environment has always just been viewed as an input with associated outputs. And it's just one of many inputs. So I definitely want to echo Mike's statement that the philosophies and just kind of viewpoints associated with the Federal Reserve System's research economists is in fact changing, but their dogma is very entrenched, and the philosophies and lens is very wide in regards to it's an economy-wide lens. So it's the pros and cons, or the positive and negative, I guess would be a positive thing, is climate change is starting to become an economy-wide topic. Before it was just kind of it was just the low and moderate incomes communities that were going to be impacted, or it was just, I mean, this is strange to say, but just New York City that was going to be impacted by ocean rise. So I think a lot of the topic was not considered relevant, but it's now starting to get clear enough that a hurricane is a macroeconomic event, not just a localized community event. So I'm not sure how much I supported or illuminated versus Mike's statement, but I think we're changing more rapidly than we ever have in the 10 plus years I've worked at the Fed on this topic, which is frankly exciting because we're a very slow moving ship. We measure our changes in decades.
And that also makes me think that like what I have described in terms of how the Fed is engaging, and I see our colleague Nishesh is on the call as well, is really externally, but Kyle and Nishesh can tell you just as well as I can that there are internal conversations and events that are happening within the Fed around climate change, around not only just from the research, but from our own operations. And Kyle's been very much a part of this in terms of how are we reducing our own carbon footprint? How are we measuring our carbon footprint, first of all, and then to know how are we reducing it? Looking at our fleet of vehicles to see, can we be purchasing different vehicles? So that's happening internally, as well as informal networking groups that are coming together from people from all parts of the bank to really talk about the importance of climate change. And so so that question really also made me think about that as well. That it's not just our economist, and it's not just our, people like me in community development.
There could possibly be a role. I mean, again, I'm not an economist either, but in the Fed's role as regulating banks, in banks have a lot of influence over loans and what money can be invested in. And right now there is definitely a bias towards cutting that tree down and selling the lumber and getting that income versus leaving the tree intact, having that many cubic pounds or cubic tons of air cleaning capacity, and how many cubic meters of water it can absorb during a rain event. So there's just benefits to the trees that some people have monetized for the sake of environmentalists, but possibly the banks don't recognize yet. And it could either be that you allow them or make them recognize what those trees look like on a balance sheet versus as a revenue stream, I guess.
Right. And not to go too far down this path, but I would venture to say if an economist was on the call right now, they would maybe say, well, if we had a carbon tax, then we could we could concretely measure what those benefits to that forest are beyond just cutting it down. Maybe they wouldn't say that. I don't know.
And if we had a bank supervisor, we would say the Fed can't pick favorites. So the forestry industry is just as much a part of the economy as the breathers, for lack of what's the alternative to who you're pointing to, Aaron? So the institution's in quite a quandary, especially because there's a lot of kind of pushback and interest in having the Fed not prop up fossil fuel industries, for example, specifically during this pandemic and our kind of pseudo quantitative easing. And the response has always been, we are an economy-wide service. We can't say one is bad, one is not, even though, of course, we all know one is destroying our children's future and the other is trying to, facilitate humanity. But unfortunately, that's becoming a political stance versus just kind of the economics 101 stance and the Fed's mandate. But again, this is Mike's presentation, not mine. So I want to make sure he does most of the talking.
Well, no, and I think like when you hear Lael Brainerd, who is a Federal Reserve governor, who I think back in 2019 now gave a speech around like the importance of climate change and like how much climate change is contributing to financial instability, or kind of down the road. To my knowledge, that was the first time a Federal Reserve governor has ever brought up climate change and financial stability in the same speech. And it took till 2019, but it finally happened. And now we are really seeing at least I can say in my 6.5 years of being at the Fed, a pretty profound shift in terms of people within the Fed taking climate change seriously. Okay, so I probably harped on that quite a bit. But happy to take other questions if you have them.
How do I don't know how to say it? How local do you think the Fed's influence reaches?
Local is in St. Louis?
Yeah.
Well, I would like to think at least that our reach kind of for our community development work, I would say I think that's kind of what one of our goals is, to kind of bring folks together and foster collaboration. And so that is probably, more tied towards kind of local influence. I'd say maybe to a lesser extent, we've got a couple researchers that are focusing more on kind of microeconomic conditions, and like Chuck Gascon being one of those. So I think that, I think he's pretty influential at the local level in terms of like more, yeah, just kind of from a pure like economic standpoint. So yeah, I guess that's.
So you have your office here, is it considered a branch or just the St. Louis office?
Yeah, it's true. I probably should have covered that earlier too. So there are 12 reserve banks in the country. The St. Louis Fed is one of 12. And then our territory is portions of 7 states. So we cover most of Missouri, and then portions like Western Kentucky, Western Tennessee, Southern Illinois, Northern Mississippi, Arkansas, and then it's like Southwest in Indiana or Southern Indiana. And so the St. Louis Fed is headquartered in St. Louis, and then we have branch locations in Memphis, Louisville, and Little Rock.
And what is, just generally speaking, the role of the branch locations?
So the branch locations are really meant to help the folks in St. Louis really understand what are the local conditions taking place within those cities, and then those kind of outlying areas around those cities.
Okay. So that's where I was going with this line of questioning. It's just kind of exploration on my part. Is like, we have a local office, what is your, what can we expect from you, or how can we look to partner with you, or, work with you, or something like that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think, historically we haven't done much around kind of climate change and climate resilience. But I'm saying within, well, broadly, but especially even within community development. Now, I think that actually may be changing. But, obviously a lot more conversations have to take place. And so I think that's a question I can't answer today, but hopefully, Aaron, I'll have, maybe more clarity in 6 months or so, 6 months to a year, be able to, talk with you and say, hey, here are the, tangible ways in which we can, partner with One STL or partner with, other similar organizations here in St. Louis.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to have too high or too broad of an expectation of what you can or allowed to do, or where your influence is. One of the things that is on my mind is one of our groups for One STL's transit-oriented development, and the developers that come to the table and talk about some of their hurdles with constructing transit-oriented development here is getting financing from banks, and I'm pretty sure it's just a local phenomenon that the banks are holding them to land use patterns that are decades old, particularly parking. And the developers are trying to say, this is a transit-oriented development. We are next to transit. We don't need this much parking. And it's not the cities, it's not the residents, it's the banks saying, we are not going to loan to you unless you have, I don't know what it is, way too much parking than you need for a TOD. So, I don't know if that's anything at all within the purview of the Fed, but it's one of those finance things that we come across, that we've been coming across locally.
That's interesting. So that is definitely within the purview of the Fed, and it's something I have not heard brought up before. Mm-hmm. So maybe we should, continue this conversation. And I'd also love to, the nice thing about working just at the Fed is I have colleagues all across the country that are working in community development. So this is a question that I can bounce off my colleagues at the San Francisco Fed or the Philly Fed or wherever, to see if they're hearing the same issues as, developers having a hard time getting financing for TOD because of banks.
Yeah, and I think it's a local phenomenon.
Okay.
Because there's other cities, when you just do Google searches, you can see lots of other cities building lots of TOD successfully. So it might be a situation where developers have to find out banks outside of the region to finance their projects.
Hmm. Okay.
But that was just an example. I just wanted to bring that up as an example. There's probably other situations where there's some sort of need that we'll have of our local financing an ecosystem, especially
Right.
when you start talking about energy and emissions and financing the resiliency of buildings and retrofitting for energy efficiency and alternative energies. There's a lot that's going to need to be financed over the coming years.
Right.
Okay, well, I will make a plan to talk to you again in the near future.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Are there any other questions from the audience before we end our webinar? Okay, I don't want to sit here too long. Well, thanks, Mike. Thanks for everybody for attending. Next month, we will be hearing from a longtime lab attendee by the name of Bobby Bonner, who is working on eco blocks in North City. We heard a presentation from eco blocks a couple years ago. So Bobby's bringing it back to the group to talk about what's going on with the group that's encouraging eco block development in the St. Louis area. So I hope you can tune into us at the end of May. And I think that's it. Take care, everybody.